Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With you, as always, is the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, Irina Zuckerman, and this week's guest is Avi Melamed. He's an author. He's the founder and CEO of IKME. It's teaching critical thinking for leaders, how to think, not what to think. And his new book has launched today. It's called Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era, and we'll be discussing the book. But before we get into the substance of the book, I'll let Avi introduce himself, his background, and how he's arrived at studying this fascinating area. Avi, the floor is yours.
Hello, Irina. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for hosting me. I really appreciate the opportunity. As you said, my name is Avi Melamed. I have three major milestones in my professional career. Israeli intelligence official, senior official on Arab affairs, and educator. As part of my positions, of course, I'm also fluent in Arabic, in addition, of course, to Hebrew and English. For the last 20 years or so, I've been working as a Middle East independent strategic and intelligence analyst. In that capacity, I'm providing all kinds of briefings, observations, analysis regarding contemporary and current affairs in the Middle East. Between 2013 and 2018, I was honored to serve as the Salisbury Fellow for Intelligence and Middle East Affairs at the Eisenhower Institute in Washington. And as you mentioned before, in 2018, I have established a US-based 501c3 called Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspective. It is an NGO that provides apolitical, non-partisan education about the Middle East and equip people with critical thinking skills and tools to navigate the way in a complex reality, and particularly when we are talking about the Middle East.
That is quite a story. Of course, I understand that as someone who worked in intelligence, you cannot divulge the deep state secrets. So I want to ask about that. But to the extent you are able to share what your experience was like in terms of where in the region you worked and what you have learned from that, whatever insights you can give us before we discuss your book, that would be great, because I'm sure everyone is very curious.
Well, as an intelligence official, as a senior Israeli official on Arab affairs, I had a variety of missions. I've been operating many years in Arab-speaking areas, and inside and outside Israel, and in addition to dealing with issues related to counter-terror activities and stuff like that, I've been also working as a senior advisor for policymakers, focusing particularly in affairs related to Arabs and relationship between Arab, Israelis, Palestinians, and so on and so on. Obviously, part of my positions were classified. Hence, of course, I will not talk about that, but as a general note, I would say that it may come as a surprise to many people, but the intelligence agencies are extracting an enormous amount of intelligence from an open source that are actually accessible to everyone or anyone. And this is, at least for the last couple of years, have become an enormous source of intelligence for all intelligence agencies.
And prior to writing this book, you had another one focused also on the Middle East, but this one is talking about a new reality. And I'll start with asking you, what are the major differences that you have come to see before the old Middle East that you had written about and this new Middle East that you'll be discussing in the new book?
Well, actually, the more, I would say, accurate way to present it would be as follows. Indeed, in 2016, I have published a book titled Inside the Middle East, Making Sense of the Most Dangerous and Complicated Region on Earth. In the 2016 book, I have already observed developments, trends, and processes that took place in the region and or will take place in the region. And I can tell you today, retrospectively, 6 years after that book was published, that roughly speaking, 95% of the predictions that I made in my 2016 book are very valid. They are standing the test of reality. So the new book that is has been published today, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era, actually shows how most of the things, or almost all of the things that I've predicted have been materialized since the period of 2016. And on top of that, I'm also indicating some further development, additional development, new nuances, sort of speaking, that are adding to the picture of the Middle East. So in a way, it wouldn't be accurate to say that the 2016 was talking about old Middle East. It was talking about contemporary Middle East. And the new book, this one that has been published today, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era, actually adds to the 2016 book and explain to the reader, shows to the reader first how many things that I have predicted in 2016 and even before that have been materialized. And second, shows the reader a three-dimensional, comprehensive and cohesive picture of the dramatically shifting geostrategic landscape of the Middle East.
Before we get more in more detail into what that actually means, let's first define what is the Middle East, because across different countries, that area of the world may be defined slightly differently. Some people even include Afghanistan in the Middle East. Others decide that they do not. What areas are you covering in your book?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the definition of the term Middle East kind of like vary during times and according to the perspectives and the disciplines. Roughly speaking, I'm covering, I would say, in my book, all the way from Morocco, in the farther western point of Africa, across Africa, or to be more accurate, across the Arab part of Africa, namely mostly North Africa, focusing, of course, in the Levant, the area that is known as the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, obviously talking about the Arab Gulf states, Iran, Turkey, and in fact, there is even one chapter in the book that is dealing with Afghanistan. Though, as you mentioned before, some people may not include Afghanistan in definition of the Middle East. Some people may include Afghanistan in definition of the Middle East. I included Afghanistan because while I was writing the book, we had this dramatic development in Afghanistan. Taliban took over control, and obviously that was a significant development that obviously will have and will have significant ramifications in the context of their, sort of speaking, like, more traditionally recognized area of the Middle East. So I've covered, to a large extent, large area in my new book, and I think it reflects a very accurate and very acute picture of the Middle East, either in its narrow or in its broader geographical dimensions.
And what is the timeline that you are discussing in terms of what is even contemporary Middle East mean? Because again, that even the timeline for people's understanding of it may vary, from instance, from the Islamic Revolution to Iran to today, or the last few years, the last 20 years since 9/11. What's the period that we are talking about?
Well, we are roughly speaking, the 20th century, and of course our time. I mean, the first 3 decades of the 21st century. Obviously, the major focus on the book is right now, meaning the second and the third, the first, the second, and the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century. But obviously, there are some elements in the books that I'm talking about the 20th century because it's important to bring those elements into the picture so we will be able to understand the most contemporary context, meaning the 21st century. For example, a large part of my book dealing with the issue of the failure of national statehood in the Middle East, particularly in the Arab world. So obviously, talking about that failure today, we have to talk about, at least generally speaking, the roots or the sources of that failure. And in order to do that, we have to talk about the 20th century. But all in all, again, the major focus of the book is the 21st century, the last 2 decades, and the beginning of the 3rd decade. These are the major focal points of the book.
To address what you just said, I'm going to ask a bit of a strange question. To what extent do you think contemporary political movements in the Middle East are helpful to the establishment of a healthy nation states, and to what extent do you think they actually contribute the opposite, destabilizing and destructive effect?
Well, the whole discussion regarding statehood in the Middle East is very complex and multidimensional. There are different factors that each one of them brings different agenda to the picture, to the table, and each one of them has a different priorities. Sometimes not only different priorities and interests, but also contradicting and colliding. Like, for example, roughly speaking, what we can call as political Islam groups, parties, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, that brings a specific Islamic agenda and as the overall ideology and philosophy. On the other hand, we can look at political parties or trends in the Arab world that, for example, was emphasizing the concept of a mega pan-Arab political structure that is not necessarily in its core Islamic. And there are different examples for the different groups. So each group brings, of course, to the table its agenda, its identity, its philosophy, its priorities. And the almost inevitable outcome of that is a collision or a very conflictual process that has evolved since day one between the different camps. And that was part, not the only reason, but that was a significant reason, one of the reasons for the failure of the concept of a national statehood in the Arab world.
Contemporary Arab writers like to emphasize the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood is failing across the Arab world, but we are seeing that in non-Arab Muslim countries such as Afghanistan, Islamist movements do not necessarily strictly speaking Muslim Brotherhood, like the Taliban, are still playing a strong role, in some cases a central role, and they're increasingly collaborating or reaching out to Islamist movements like Hamas and that are strictly Arab. How do you see that playing out in the future? Do you see that Islamist movements from non-Arab countries are going to have a significant effect on the Arab world, or do you think that Islamism is largely contained and it's not going to make much of a difference?
Well, Islam is a philosophy, is an ideology, is a way of life, is an outlook. And so it's very much embedded and rooted in the Muslim world, generally speaking. It is almost integral part of majority of the people who live in the Muslim world. Obviously, there are people who live within Muslim states and countries who are not Muslims, but most of them, of course, are overwhelmingly Muslims, and therefore Islam is a very significant identity component for them as individual, as a societal, political, cultural structure. That being said, one of the things that I've observed already back in my previous book and before that, and in course of time since 2016, since my previous book was published, and currently right now, that prediction that I made was very accurate. And the prediction was that I have predicted an evolving crisis within political Islam camp. So, for example, I have predicted a split within the Muslim Brotherhood as an outcome of a deep political and particularly ideological crisis. That prediction has been totally materialized. We have witnessed the split of chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood in places like Jordan, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Morocco, in Egypt. Other thing that I've predicted was that the more pragmatic camp within political Islam will become more and more powerful at the expense of the more dogmatic camp. That's exactly what happened in all the places I mentioned and others. So all in all, when you look at the political Islam camp, Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic movement and others, you can see this inner crisis, you could see this inner conflict within those groups. And that, of course, has a lot of impact in the surrounding environment. One of the manifestations, for example, or the outcome of that inner split within political Islam, within Muslim Brotherhood particularly, was that the new pragmatic camp within political Islam is more centered around the idea of the national statehood, which is, of course, a very significant shift ideologically speaking, because the core ideology of political Islam, and particularly Muslim Brotherhood, one of the core ideologies was the rejection of the idea of national statehood and the vision or the envisioning the creation of the caliphate. And it's interesting to see how pragmatic camp within political Islam are actually not only centering around the idea of national statehood, they also vow openly to prioritize the idea of national statehood, even over the core ideology of Islamism. And this is, of course, very interesting development, because, as you can understand, it has an enormous ramifications on the political fabric in different places, like, for example, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria. And this is only one example of that shift. So this is a process that I have been indicating already at the early part of the Arab Spring, going back to 2010, 2011. And I basically emphasized that prediction in my previous book in 2016. As of today, 6 years later, 2022, my prediction on that issue is very well valid and accurate.
We're seeing a couple of different models, political models developing in Middle Eastern countries. We are seeing kind of traditional monarchies and other kind of autocratic or authoritarian states trying to emphasize national identity over tribal or political movement type structure that has previously driven the political direction of those countries. At the same time, as you just mentioned, these political Islamist movements have been adapting to these trends and looking to center their own power around the same type of model. What do you think is likely to prevail, given that the significant portions of populations do adhere to some of the selling points, I would say, of this political Islam movements, and given the emphasis the Western societies have put on quote-unquote democracy?
Well, one of my major observations in this book, and I think it's quite an exceptional observation when I look at the surrounding discussion, I observe what I call the early seeds of potentially evolving new model of statehood in the Arab world. Now, I'm saying it's exceptional because as of now, it's, of course, given to the whole chaos in different parts of the Arab world, the challenges, the violence in different parts of the Arab world. Obviously, it's very difficult to say at this point. The observation that I'm making seems to be a little bit not dialoguing with reality, but this is part of the ability to look beyond the noise and to try to detect some interesting processes and developments. In that context, I do identify the emerging interesting dialogue / power struggle between, roughly speaking, couple of major camps within the Arab states. One of them we mentioned before is political Islam, and I talked about the interesting shift that took place within part of political Islam's chapters, like the Muslim Brotherhood, as I mentioned before. The other camp is what I call the civil society camp. We clearly see, at least I can clearly see, the constantly growing and empowering of the camp of civil society in the Arab world. And another interesting phenomenon is what I call the beginning of kind of like defining new ground or new rules for the terms of civil responsibility as well as governmental responsibility. And actually what I'm looking at this picture through these three angles, civil society camp, civil responsibility and governmental accountability, and the shift within political Islam movement, what we see is a very interesting fluctuations, like change in the geopolitical fabric and the political fabric of many different Arab countries, like in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Sudan, in Egypt, in Jordan, and others, that actually could indicate some interesting process of emerging, potentially, new model of a state. Now, I have to be very clear about it. We are looking at something that is very turbulent. It's a long-term process. There are no guarantees it's going to be successful. But I think it's important to indicate that. Now, one of the things it's important to indicate that has to do with what you mentioned before, Irina, when you talked about the issue of the Western lenses of democracy. I think it's important to emphasize that we may see, and we see, a process of what you can call democratization in the Arab world. But I have to emphasize that it will be a mistake to expect a model of democracy in the Middle East that will be totally overlapping the model of democracy as we know it in the West. It is not the same kind of democracy. And I think that in the West, there should be an internalizing of that idea, of that concept, that trying to apply one-to-one the Western model of democracy in the Middle East is doomed to fail. There could be some element and some significant elements of democratization, which part of them are already taking place, but it would be a mistake to expect an application of a Western model style of democracy on a scale of one-to-one when it comes to the Arab world and Muslim countries.
You know, 10 years after the Arab Spring, and I'm going to get a little bit provocative, would it be fair to say that Western governments, as opposed to civil society leaders and activists and so forth, and just general population, but Western governments were not necessarily looking for a democracy in the Middle East, because they were fully aware that many of these political movements were not, in fact, democratic in nature. They were hierarchical, highly structured, and a lot of what we saw on the ground in Egypt and elsewhere was driven by specific actors rather than spontaneous, popular mobilization. Would you say that it's fair? Do you think it's fair to say that these governments were looking for a more controllable version, still structured and not necessarily democratic, that they were more comfortable with and that they thought they could control, as opposed to really truly seeking pluralistic democracy? Or would it be fair to say that perhaps they projected the vision of being naive and wishing for a new Switzerland in Tunisia and Egypt, but in reality, it was in fact a calculated push for a particular type of government that they knew would not be truly democratic?
Well, look, first of all, I cannot refer it as a category to the term Western governments, because there are different governments in the West, and they have different policies, and they have different priorities, and they have different political agenda, and so on. I can, for example, refer, let's say, to the most significant player, the Western player, and this is the United States of America. So when you look at the last decade, starting from the Arab Spring to our time, you could see very clearly the what I call the shifts in terms of the different American administrations. Remember, we had Obama's administration from 2008 until 2016. Obama's administration was actually, in the time where the wall or the wave of the Arab Spring was hitting the area, across the area. And then we got the Trump administration from 2016 to 2020, and now we got Biden administration. So obviously, roughly speaking, when you look, for example, regarding your question, when you look at Obama's administration, the major argument, one of the major arguments that is made in the Arab world, and I have to emphasize it, in the Arab world towards Obama's administration, one of the major arguments was that Obama's administration was outreaching to factors like the Muslim Brotherhood or the Iranian regime. These are two different entities, but in the eyes of the Arab, or in the eyes of factors in the Arab world, like Egypt, like the Gulf monarchies, Jordan, Morocco, and others, in their eyes, that was a policy that was very wrong, very mistaken, and they, up until today, you can find different explanation they provide in order to explain why did Obama's administration, for example, was outreaching the Muslim Brotherhood? Why did Obama's administration was outreaching to the Iranians? Some of the Arab commentators arguing it's about naivete. They're arguing that it was motivated by some sort of like very naive, flat outlook of the situation, even lack of understanding of the situation. But there are many other Arab commentators and intellectuals who argue that that was a very well cynical, calculated move by the Obama's administration, that they knew exactly who they were reaching out to. And you will find up until today, and we probably will continue forever, this debate within the Arab world, what were the real reasons for the policies that Obama's administration was when it comes to Trump administration, there is kind of like an opposite picture, in the sense that in the Arab world, there was a great acceptance of the Trump's administration, mostly because Trump administration obviously made a 180-degree shift towards Iran in comparison to Obama. And second, because Trump administration didn't really, let's put it like this, didn't overemphasize the idea of human rights, civil rights, and stuff like that. That was much more emphasized in the time of Obama's administration. And now we are once again in another flip, and this is Biden administration. So I can tell you that when President Biden term began, in the Arab world, there was, roughly speaking, a big question mark. The question mark was whether Biden administration is going to be Obama #2, or not necessarily, maybe it's going to be something different. And yet again, once again, there has been different opinions in the Arab world regarding Biden administration. And again, it centers all around the issue of like, to what extent the current administration, the Biden administration, to what extent that administration accurately reads the reality in the Middle East, to what extent Biden administration accurately addresses the Iranian threat, to what extent Biden administration apply a realistic policy vis-a-vis Islamic movement in the region. These are all questions that are all the time there in the Arab public realm, day in, day out. I would say, roughly speaking, that there is one common denominator to the Obama's administration, Trump administration, and Biden administration, and that is that you all the time you find this very delicate dance between two major components that shapes the US policy in the region. One is what I call the real politics, a component that has been quite substantial one traditionally in the shaping of the US policy in the region. And the other component that has been growing stronger in time, and particularly during the last decade, and the other component is what I call the ideal politics, meaning the agenda that promotes or emphasizes or centers around issues of human rights, civil rights, and others. And there has been all the time this very delicate dance between those two components in the mindset of the U.S. policy shapers. And this is something that is a kind of like a way for the Arab commentators to try to evaluate where the wind is blowing, what direction the wind is blowing. And I think this is something that will continue and see that and even more emphasized down the road.
The other big factor, aside from these political moments, of course, has been Iran, as you mentioned, and specifically the fact that its proxies have become almost entities and states or semi-states unto themselves. They've become either formed symbiotic relationships with governments like Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the point that they've become elected to governments, or they've become significant actors in states like Iraq and so forth. And Hezbollah has an independent power of all the missiles that it has accumulated, to the point that even if when it does not function fully as a state, it has the power of one, and it certainly has the power to hold the region hostage due to the uncontrollable nature of its weapons. How do you see the region reacting to that? This is the one factor that none of the administrations have fully addressed, really. They've either ignored them or tried to go around it, or try to work with some of these actors as if they're not really there. There hasn't been a holistic strategy to view all these proxies as part of the same problem, really. We've seen the back and forth with the Houthis. Trump designated them at the very end of his term. Biden removed them. Hezbollah has been a terrorist organization, but Biden has been trying to work with them to some extent. Hamas, Biden has returned to trying to work with them to some capacity, and Israel has never fully divested from trying to manage them in some way, and Iraqi proxies also. So what do you see as the future of this? Do you see Israel, Arab states, and US at some point finally coming to see these groups as part of one cohesive scenario that needs to be dealt with holistically, or do you think it's going to continue like what we see today?
Well, there are so many aspects to what you asked. Obviously, this is one of the major crucial issues in the Middle East today. Look, I've been writing about the Iranian threat, and I've been talking about the Iranian threat for many years. I have very accurately described in advance many years ago the Iranian master plan, and I explained time and again that the Iranians are building a very sophisticated network of armies around the region. You mentioned some of them, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip, Iraqi Shiite militias, the Houthis in Yemen. And I've warned time and again that the Iranians are moving on with their master plan, and they're about to take the region hostage, obviously with all the bad ramifications that come with it. I wrote about it, I warned about it. Unfortunately, it seems like policymakers in the West, for whatever the reason was, did not really address that challenge. Now, look, as a fact, Obama's administration, for example, totally failed to address that challenge. In fact, I would say that Obama's administration totally ignored the component of the Iranian-backed armies of terror. The JCPOA that was signed during the time of Obama's administration actually was playing to the hands of the Iranians. This is not a political observation, it's facts on the ground. I have to emphasize that because I'm aware of the fact that there are many people, there are some circles in the West who try to, in a way, explain the Iranian aggression and the Iranian growing aggression. They are trying to explain it, saying that that's the reactions of the Iranians for the fact the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA. That is that is a distorted presentation of the reality. The other way around is the accurate one, and figures and facts on the ground proves that. Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA because of the growing Iranian aggression. And unfortunately, there are circles in the West that prefer to avoid facts on the grounds and dates and chronology, but the dates and chronology leave no place for doubt about it. This is one of the things I present very clearly in my book. So I think it has to be also understood. Now, there is a lot of confusion in the West regarding how exactly to deal with this whole growing challenge. It is no doubt that the Iranians identified the weakness of the West in that sense, and they played that card very well. We just had a recent examples of the fact that, as I've been warning for many years, Iran is taking hostage the region and beyond the region. The recent attacks of Iranian-backed Houthis on the UAE is one example. The growing aggression of Iran and its proxies in the Arab Gulf, in the Red Sea, and of course the struggle of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to get free of the Iranian occupation or the Iranian growing influence. All of these are manifestation of that development, that very severe development that happened in the region, particularly in the last decade. As a fact, the Western policymakers, in spite of their rhetoric, in spite of their very strong statements sometimes, have failed actually practically to address that challenge. And indeed, in my book, I explore in depth the whole Iranian master plan. And I provide lots of chronology, facts, figures to basically prove and to end once and for all this distorted argument that is kind of like common within some circles in the West. Iran is working according to a very structured, sophisticated master plan. The nuclear power and the Iranian armies of terror scattered in the region are integrated. One is securing the other. And it is very unfortunate that the West, I don't know to say if the West actually did not identify that, but as a fact, I can say that the West failed to successfully address that. Successfully address that would have meant that the Iranian master plan would have been confronted and blocked. That would have been a successful outcome of a Western policy. That did not happen. In fact, the contrary happened. The Iranian master plan has been further moving on, further escalating, further resulting in more chaos and instability in the region. And this is one of the outcomes of the failure of Western policymakers to effectively address the Iranian master plan. And many people in the region already paid dear price. See what happened in Syria, for example. See what happened in Lebanon. See what happened in Yemen. Many people paid with their lives. Many became refugees. Millions. Cities and villages have turned to dust. And to a large extent, it is all because of the failure to address effectively the Iranian master plan. And this is something that has to be understood. This is something that has to be recorded for history to come. Because, as I said again, unfortunately I identify more than once some tendency within some circles in the West to not present accurately the chronology of the events, failing to present accurately the chain of cause and outcome, cause and effect. They basically turn things upside down, and that has to be fixed.
I'm not sure whether you'll agree or not, but some of the basic questions that being asked by Western, or at least definitely US policymakers about Iran and the nature of the regime on both sides of the aisle, by the way, both the quote-unquote pro-Iran groups and the quote-unquote Iran, Iran cautious, I would say, or Iran hawks, have been inaccurate. One of the things has been obsession with the Israeli strikes and whether or not they will permanently disrupt the nuclear program. Another question has been about the fall of the regime and what that would look like. No one has any idea because there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of the complexity of the regime. Right now, what I'm seeing is a trend in Iran hawk circles is a rather naive idea that 80 million Iranians are waiting to be saved by Americans and Israelis and are going to be our best friends. And all they need to do is topple the Ayatollahs and then everything is going to be fine. That to me seems extremely misinformed and even dangerous in formulating a coherent strategy. What's your opinion?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm not familiar with that concept that you are presenting. I may guess there are some people in the West who think that way. I don't really know how to address that because I'm not familiar with that concept. But I can say from a different perspective that I can say, look, I've been in different forums more than once, where people were saying, the Mullah regime is about to fall in a short period of time, and I was very skeptic about it, and I didn't see that happening so fast. And as of now, my cautious and my skepticism was very well justified. The Mullah regime holds indeed the Iranian people in an iron grip, though there are scholars and experts, including Iranians, that I have been following, and I really appreciate their opinions and their outlook. They seems to be quite confident in the scenario that the day would come and the Iranian people will rise up and topple down the Mullah regime. It may happen, but it may not. Currently, I don't see the Mullah regime facing such a danger. Even though, of course, there are some processes in Iran that we should be following closely, and I mentioned them in the book, because they may indicate, of course, this growing unrest, upheaval within the Iranian people. I would say that it would be accurate or fair enough to say as a reflection of the situation that it would be, I would say, accurate to say that overwhelming majority of the Iranians are definitely not lining up with the ideology. They are not necessarily supporting its ideology. They are not identifying with ideology, and obviously they are very resentful of the very poor performances of the Mullah regime at home, in terms of the economic challenges, poverty, unemployment, drug abuse, and many other challenges and illness the Iranian people are suffering constantly and increasing. But I don't know to say about the concept that you mentioned before, that 80 million Iranians are expecting Israel or the United States to free them. I may expect there may be some.
No. My point was not that the Iranians are actually expecting that, but that Westerners, Americans, some American circles think that that's what's happening.
Yeah, I know. I said
some
Westerners thinking that concept,
yes,
more than Iranian concept. No, I'm not familiar with it, even though, of course, I'm sure that such a concept may exist in some circles in the West. But I don't have anything special to say about that beyond what you said.
A far more likely trajectory that seems to be is the entry of China and the optimization of the surveillance state in Middle Eastern countries, where China is forming very effective short-term and long-term partnerships, while the US is kind of distancing itself from more active participation in those affairs. And that kind of suggests to me that China's presence in the Middle East may kind of reform some of the liberalization trends that US and others have been welcoming in recent years, and kind of China's efforts have been to try to create some sort of a balance between Iran and the kind of anti-Iran faction, states and groups and populations in the Middle East, but always to its own benefit. How do you see that playing out, and what can be done to kind of limit the damage from that potential and likely developments?
Well, as you accurately mentioned, yes, China is present in the Middle East, and it has a growing presence and accordingly a growing influence in the Middle East, all across the Middle East. And it's going hand in hand or in parallel to the decline or to the decreasing influence of Western powers in the Middle East. One of the things I refer to in my book is actually the end of the Western hegemony in the Middle East and the rise to power in the area of what I call the Eastern giants, namely China. We should also think very seriously about India in that context down the road, and of course the growing presence of Russia under the leadership of Putin in different parts of the Middle East. Look, when you look at the when you compare the two major systems, the Chinese foreign policy system and let's say the Western, roughly speaking, or to be more precise, the U.S. policy guidelines, you could see that they are totally opposite. The U.S., the Western policy has this inner delicate conflict, complex conflict between ideal politics and real politics, which sometimes make it very difficult to shape a cohesive, solid foreign policy. That thing does not exist in the Chinese foreign policy. The Chinese are not bothered and are not concerned about the issues of human rights in their foreign policy. The Western policy is guided by the concept of multiculturalism and inclusiveness and dialogue and openness. The Chinese foreign policy is coming from a place that is very much condescending and definitely doesn't view other cultures and civilizations as equal to the Chinese one. There is a sense of condescending or at least superiority within the Chinese mindset vis-a-vis other civilizations. The Chinese are inclining traditionally to a soft power. They traditionally stay away or try to stay away from any kind of like military involvement, but their version of soft power is very tough in comparison to the Western style soft power. So all in all, there are different factors that indicates the total difference between the two systems, and that can explain, for example, why the Chinese are becoming more and more influential player in the region. And in fact, when you look today in the Middle East, as a fact, China is at all the most strategic locations. China is at the Gulf, China is at the Red Sea, China is at the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. Major players in the region, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Egypt, Israel, are having a very significant relationship with China, and they are growing and expanding. I would say that for all those players that I mentioned in the context of China, there is a sense of like an inner conflict. On the one hand, they all realize and understand that China is too much of an important player to be overlooked. You cannot ignore China. You don't ignore 1.3 billion people nation. And accordingly, you could see the outcome on the ground. You could see the Chinese investments in physical infrastructure, in trade, in harbors, in trains. These are all huge investments that are not done for the sake of glory. So all the players in the region understand that, and they know there has to be a payment in return. On the other hand, there is a growing resentment and discontent and concern within many players in the region who are traditionally looking at themselves as part of the Western camp, and particularly allies of the United States, There is a growing concern as an outcome of the fact that clearly there is growing difficulty of the Western power to stabilize the situation on the ground in the area. The Western basically failed to stabilize the Middle East in the last 2 decades, and the reality speaks for itself. And therefore, the players in the region that are looking for stability, that need stability, are in a very natural way will look at anyone they believe can provide that stability. China can do that. China can do that because China has a big sticks, and China will not hesitate to use big stick if it needs to maintain and to secure its interests. So, for example, the Chinese are very much concerned about the Iranian aggression. So on the one hand, China and Iran are very close allies. Iran is a significant provider of oil to China. The Iranians are very much dependent on the Chinese. It's a very tight connection. But on the other hand, the Chinese are also having significant connections, much more important in many ways, with the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia. And they are tuned to their needs for stability. And when the Chinese convey a message, everyone in the region listens, everyone. And this is quite different from the situation with the West. You know, as I paraphrased it recently in one of my engagements, I say like, well, you hear about rockets that are being launched at the American embassy or Western bases across the Middle East. You don't hear about rockets being launched on Chinese embassies. You don't shoot rockets on Chinese embassies in the Middle East. It's not a wise policy. And that, to a large extent, says the difference between the powers. Now, in terms of stability, I would say again, as I said, that there are many players in the region who this is their first and most significant interest, and they need the stability, and they will line up with whoever they think is able to provide that stability.
Well, whether China can and whether it will provide stability to different questions. So far, we are seeing that China has sold drones to the Houthis. It has been willing to develop bases and joint programs with UAE and Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, it has provided Iran with surveillance tools and other tools that make it more of a danger to its neighbors. So I'm not sure that China is playing as much of a stabilizing role as simply doing business with whoever it can to its own interests. So far, we have not seen China politically intervening in any of Iran's proxy wars or putting any sort of significant pressure to put an end to Iran's aggression. So that's a question these other states should be asking themselves: Is the potential for China's stabilizing role really worth the cost of doing business with it? Because so far, I don't really see it bearing out, except on a very tactical level. I don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to end with an obvious question, and that's the role of Abraham Accords. Unlike most people who are, let me put it this way, I don't want to come across as someone who's skeptical of the concept, not at all, quite the opposite. I've always been very enthused. My issue is not with the idea, but with the implementation. Since the signing of Abraham Accords, we have seen significant challenges in Israel's defense relations with some of the countries. We have seen a very slow people-to-people reintegration, despite many announcements, MOUs, cultural initiatives, and so forth. The reality on the ground is that the changes have been with the people have been very slow, and we're seeing the lack of US support for this initiative, which was kind of a guarantor of the success of these processes. And we have seen reluctance of other states to join while Biden is in power. Where do you see this process going? Do you think there will be radically positive changes that we can expect in the future? What's the best pathway to overcome the current challenges? And do you think US presence is needed to make sure that very culturally different countries don't go off the rail in the process?
Well, Irina, look, first, I think we have to distinguish between different, look, the agreement between Israel and Egypt, the peace agreement and the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, you're right. I mean, we didn't see in those agreements, we didn't see the evolving of people-to-people peace aspects or level. It remains more or less in the governmental level, sort of speaking. But on the other hand, the peace has been kept, and it has been survived and was successfully passing some very severe tests and milestones along the way. The Israel UAE peace agreement, or the whole frame of the Abraham Accord, is different in many ways. And one of the ways it's different, for example, is people to people, because when I'm looking at the element of people to people in the Israeli UAE peace agreement in comparison to the Israeli or Egyptian or Israeli Jordanian peace agreement, you could see immediately the differences. This is kind of like a very, what we say, warm peace agreement, meaning it across the level of government, it percolates to the level of people, and it's a mutual process. It's a mutual process. No, it's not only one side. That being said, obviously, there are many aspects that has to be looked at course of time. I have predicted in my previous book, when I wrote about it, I have predicted the formation of this growing alliance between Israel and Arab Gulf monarchies. I have attributed to different things, like, for example, the Iranian challenge, the need of countries in the region to adjust themselves to the 21st century in terms of technological implementations, stuff like that. And indeed, my prediction was clearly materialized. I predict that the Israeli UAE peace agreement will continue and expand. The foundations for that will expand because it's based upon long-term strategic interests. Now, I am aware of the fact that, you know, in the Middle East, everything is dynamic. Today, my enemy can be tomorrow my best friend, right? So, for example, yeah, there may be a situation where tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, the United Arab Emirates and Iran will resume relationship. Saudi Arabia and Iran will resume relationship. But in the end of the day, the fundamental suspicious between the sides will not go away. The Saudis and the Emirates know exactly what they are dealing with. They have no illusions about the Iranian regime. So they will definitely try to secure themselves as much as possible. In such an environment where you have large regional factors like Turkey, like Iran, that are leading very aggressive regional policy that inevitably comes at the expense of the Arab states, it's only natural to expect that Arab states will look for different mechanisms to secure their interests. And in that sense, Israel plays a very significant role in the service of those Arabs' interests. It's not about love and affection. It's about interest and geostrategic interest. And this is the way nations conduct their relationship and should conduct their relationship. That's the reason why I expect the agreement foundation to be solid and even to expand. We just saw the other day, a couple of days ago, an openly security agreement signed between Israel and Bahrain. And basically, when I'm saying Israel and Bahrain, we have to add almost immediately, it's actually, at the end of the day, it's Saudi Arabia. So we understand that this is kind of like a growing cooperation, centers around very specific long-term strategic interests, and they are not going to change. Even tomorrow morning, if the Iranian regime will stop its hostilities in the region, I don't think that the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis will rush to turn their back to Israel. And I think that this is part of the reconfiguration of the geostrategic landscape. This is one of the things I'm discussing in my book, like many other things. And also, by the way, when we're talking about it, obviously we have to talk, as I'm doing in my book, when I'm talking about the enormous ramifications of that in the context of the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
The Palestinian issue has become sort of a less urgent and less of a priority. I wouldn't say it has completely disappeared. And one concern that I have had is that the political movements that are putting pressure on some of these countries are trying to use that and religious issues as a point of internal, to generate internal discontent in those countries, particularly in I would say in Saudi Arabia, and also pro-Iran factions in Bahrain. So while I have no doubt that the governments of those countries are on the trajectory which you just described, at the same time, they're facing internal pressures that Israel is in no position to address. How do you see, and I could see Iran exploiting these internal tensions, and it is actually trying to now link the Palestinian issue with the war in Yemen, with other things. We are seeing that through Hezbollah communications. So these Israel's new allies are facing significant internal problems, which show that none of these positive developments can be taken for granted, even with the full goodwill of the current defense and security strategy. And that raises a question: is Israel's alliance with these states enough to stabilize the region, to face the Iranian threats? Without US presence, without a very positive force, not a neutral slash self-interested force like China, but an actually strong allied force with all these countries, can this be anything more than a kind of temporary slash tactical managing of the issue? Can the Middle East solve the Iran and other significant problems by itself, with the US not really present?
Well, that's a significant question. Look, there are many factors that involve in this story of the Iranian aggression and the ramifications on the Middle East. You mentioned very accurately one major component, and this is, of course, the armies of terror that the Iranian regime nurtured and established and supports across the region. That being said, I mean, we have also to look at some other interesting. One of the interesting things that I also refer to that in my book was that as an outcome of this Iranian aggression, we have witnessed a counter reaction of parts of the Arab world who are particularly suffering the Iranian intervention. And I'm mostly talking about Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. We saw what happened in Syria. The Syrian people paid a terrible price, to a large extent, trying to get rid of the Iranian influence. We saw what happened in Syria. The Iraqi people are paying a terrible price. The Lebanese are paying a terrible price. But each of those states is in a different position vis-a-vis that issue. Some in a more potentially promising trajectory to get free of the Iranian grip. Some of them are in a less promising position of trajectory of getting free of the Iranian grip. And I refer to all these three in depth in my book when I'm talking particularly about those three states. There are voices in the Arab world who are talking about forming some sort of an Arab NATO. I don't know to say necessarily if this is a scenario that is going to be materialized tomorrow morning. We do have, in a way, non-framed or non-formal alliance that includes the Gulf monarchies, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, but not necessarily in a formal frame of sort of like a Middle East NATO power. So all in all, there are different means and levels, militarily speaking, economically speaking, culturally speaking, politically speaking, where the Middle East can try and to push back and throw back the Iranian aggression and also the Turkish aggression, even though the Turkish aggression is less disastrous in its outcomes in comparison to the Iranian one. Would that be enough or sufficient? I'm not so sure. And obviously, I would say that the help or the involvement or the decisive involvement of the United States and the West to draw red lines on the sand, not to be crossed, in order to stop the Iranian aggression, I would say that this involvement is very significant for the people of the region. And basically, we can see how the major players in the region the Saudis, the Emirates, Israel, and others are actually asking the United States and the West not to sacrifice the region at the altar of the Iranian regime master plan. So there is a very clear need and calls from those players to the West to be decisive and conduct a tough line if needed in order to stop the Iranians. Israel, for example, is making a very interesting position. Israel says time and again, Israel says, like, we think that agreement with Iran regarding its nuclear power, it's the preferable way, but Israel at the same time will not be committed to such an agreement. Israel would not be obliged to act according to agreement because Israel is not part of that agreement. And Israel, unfortunately, is standing on the first line of the Iranian aggression. And that's something significant to take into consideration. Obviously, there is the role of Egypt that has to be taken into consideration. Egypt is a very significant military power in the region. And Egypt has made it very clear more than once that there are some red lines that Egypt will not allow nobody to cross, particularly when it comes to the issue of what Egypt evaluates as its enormously strategic assets like the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Eastern Basin, the gas in the Eastern Basin of the Mediterranean, and others. So, yes, the Middle East players who wants to stop the Iranian aggression has means to do that, but additional support, additional international cooperation, and much more decisive approach by the Western policymaker should be applied in order to address the Iranian aggression. And I want to remind us all, there are series of United Nations Security Council resolutions that are actually calling decisively to restrict, to limit the Iranian aggression. There are United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding the Hezbollah and the disarming of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. There are United Nations Security Council resolution regarding the situation in Yemen and the demilitarizing of the Hodeidah port controlled by the Houthis, which is a major port for which the Iranians are arming and equipping the Houthis in Yemen. And there are other significant UN Security Council resolutions that basically provide the legal and international consensus to a much more tough and decisive Western approach to be part of this cohesive system that, in the end of the day, should thwart and push back the Iranian aggression. The Iranian aggression presents the region and beyond the region a very significant threat.
We are seeing that just as this success in security coordination with Israel is rising, non-state actors backed by state actors such as human rights organizations and assorted activists are looking to disrupt and push back on these relationships through reports, political campaigns, leaks, and all sorts of disruptive activities that we are seeing. The Amnesty International report attacking Israel as an apartheid state and essentially giving ammunition to leftist BDS movements in Western countries. We're seeing the campaign against the Israeli cybersecurity companies around the world, which has been an essence of Israel's relationship and diplomatic relations with the states, with the Arab states and other countries. What do you think can be done to minimize the damage from these disruptive movements, especially in conjunction with the increasing polarization in the US, in Europe, with the increasing rise of extreme left woke identitarians that kind of fall for all of this ideological soft power abuse, I would say, even.
Well, Irina, as you mentioned earlier, there are organizations that, unfortunately, we all know that. I mean, Amnesty International, we all understand that it became quite a very distorted body, and particularly when you look the way that body addressed Israel. Just give an example. I mean, the continuing muteness of these organizations and other big bodies of human rights vis-a-vis the catastrophe in Syria that is going on for more than 10 years speaks for itself. I mean, we all understand that we are looking at organizations that have a very biased agenda, and that's a shame. That's a shame not only because it's distorting reality and it's immoral, but also because it actually blocks and disrupts the ability of people in the region to really make progress towards something that will be positive. And then there is another reason it's a shame, because there are many people in the West who, from their own narratives or perspectives, which are all valid for, and I respect all narratives, almost all narratives, are really genuinely thinking that, taking that path or the other path is the right path to take. And sometimes many of them are taking the path that actually are mostly criticizing Israel and, putting the blame on Israel and so on, which is their right, it's legitimate. I don't say necessarily that I agree with those narratives. And that brings me actually to refer to your question, and my answer is, the answer is education. Look, I'm always saying I'm not an Israeli spokesperson, I'm not a Palestinian spokesperson. I don't deal with narratives. I deal with reality and trying to understand reality to the best of my ability and trying to reflect to the best of my professional integrity that we are. Now, there are two kinds of people who stick to their narratives, whatever the reality is, and that's fine. If they want to stick to their narratives, this is their choice. I respect that. I would have said, however, that it's very clear that if you stick to your narratives and you fail to understand the reality, your ability to really make an impact on the reality is very slim. And your ability to make a positive impact on the reality is even slimmer. And there is a second type of people who have their narratives, they believe in their narratives, yet they are still open to look and explore the reality, understanding that their narratives and the reality may not overlap. Moreover, they understand that following the learning of the reality, they may have to compromise their narratives. On the one hand, it's a very frightening process. It's a painful process when you have to subscribe your narratives to reality and not the other way around. But on the other hand, once you do that, you have a better ability in comparison to people who subscribe reality to the narratives. People who subscribe narratives to the reality have a better chance to maybe impact positively reality in the right direction. And let's go back to my point. It's about education. And I can say decisively, based upon my many meetings and encounters with all kinds of audiences that are coming from different political perspectives, I can say decisively that there is one clear need that is being expressed time and time again, particularly in the United States, but also in other places in the West, and that is the need for real education. What does it mean, real education? It means an education that to the best ability is providing picture of complex reality while putting narratives aside. I don't negate narratives, I don't undermine narratives, I respect narratives. I just don't deal with narratives, I deal with reality. Narratives and realities are two different things. And it is no wonder that I hear more and more demand by people, progressives, conservatives, from all walks of the political spectrum. They are saying very clearly, we need education, we need real education. The reason they are saying that is because in the end of the day, there is no way to escape. In the end of the day, narratives and reality in most of the case do not go together. Something is not working. one of the component is irrelevant or inaccurate. And more people realize that. And that's the reason for the need in education. An education that really provides people a professional objective to the best of my capacity, education about the Middle East and understanding this complex picture. And I think people are very appreciative of it. And I believe that there is more and more growing understanding that people don't need any more of narratives. People need more and more education. This is what I'm dealing with.
Oh, I agree with you completely. The question is who and where and how is going to break through the narratives that have become kind of a norm and start providing opportunities for education. Yes, there's independent efforts, but at the end of the day, the mainstream, especially we are seeing that in the US, has become overtaken by narratives, not just on Israel, but on literally everything. And that's become a problem that affects the entire society. Let's hope we can somehow manage through it and until we become like one of those societies prior to the recent changes in the Middle East, where it was just a battle of factions in the media and on the street, and with no real truth to be found anywhere. Thank you so much for your insights today. I look forward to reading your book, and I hope that our listeners, people watching this show, will also be inspired to read both of your books actually, and to follow your work. I look forward to watching it as well. I've attended one of your lectures recently, and I really recommend it, especially to learn and understand some of the basic issues in the Middle East that's become convoluted and actually misreported a lot of the times. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a very successful trip in the United States. For those watching us, this was Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. We'll see you again next week, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Good night. Thank you.